The BRICS summit continues, finishes tomorrow. The big leaders who are here leave on their presidential planes back to their presidential palaces, and we'll be left here wondering what, if anything, has been achieved. Yes, deals have been signed, promises have been committed to, pledges have been made, but I find myself in a sort of situation of going, I don't know. I just don't know. Let's talk to Eric Olander, Editor-in-Chief of the China Global South Project, who is with us now via Zoom. Eric, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you.
We need BRICS for a multipolar world. We need to enlarge BRICS. We need more members so we can be more powerful, more united. We need to move away from the SWIFT system and a dollar-based international trade currency. How important are these things in your view?
Well, that's certainly the talking points coming out of Moscow and Beijing. It's not entirely clear if any of that is actually ever going to happen. I mean, the BRICS has been around for, 8 years? I mean, your ambivalence and your frustration in trying to put a shape to this thing, I think, is warranted, because this thing has been here for 8 years. Besides building a mid-level development bank based in Shanghai, point me to one or two of the successes of the BRICS. And think about it, if they've barely been able to get anything done with 5 members, organizations don't get more efficient and more effective with more members in it, right? So adding more countries is not necessarily going to lead to a more effective organization. So I think there's good reason to be skeptical about it.
Doesn't it create an organization which implicitly needs to be taken more seriously because more and more people are wanting to join it? It becomes a kind of magnetic North Pole or magnetic South Pole to the pro-West magnetic North Pole of G7.
Now you're getting somewhere here. So the power of the BRICS is not in the substance of what it generates. This is not a group like NATO or a group that actually produces policy outcomes and delivers real results for its constituents. At least it hasn't done so yet. What the power of the BRICS and why it's so important is the symbolism. It's a stage for countries that have been marginalized by, the global North, that are fed up with the hypocrisy, fed up with the duplicity, fed up with the double talk that comes out of countries like Germany, the US, UK, Japan, who say one thing and do another, who create the problems in the climate and then ask South Africa to pay for the just climate transition programs or the just energy transition programs, mostly through concessional loans. I mean, that's not just, right? You have to pay interest on that debt. So the BRICS provides that stage, that platform for people to say we've had enough. And that's the power of the BRICS, more than a currency, more than, any of these other, pie in the sky things that may or may not happen. Because at the end of the day, let's not forget that India and China, don't get along. They've got tens of thousands of troops massed on each other's side of the border. So if those two don't get along, the entire viability of the BRICS project becomes in question. But the symbolism of what it means is definitely something that should be heard. Grievance is powerful in politics, and the BRICS today is a channel for grievance.
It was interesting that there have been differences of opinion expressed. The Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been very critical of the West, as has quite obviously Vladimir Putin in his video inserts into the conference. President Lula of Brazil and our foreign minister Naledi Pandor said, hold on a second, we don't want to characterize BRICS as something which is anti-West. We want to stand for something rather than against something.
There are real cleavages in the ideological viewpoint, in part because the smaller countries like Brazil and South Africa know that they can get crushed if they get sucked into a geopolitical contest between Russia, the Chinese, and the Americans. That's not a space that's healthy for South Africa or for smaller countries. And so it's going to be very important that those smaller countries, and again, Brazil is not entirely a small country, but in the context of China, yes, it is here. And President Lula has said, we don't want this to be a counterweight to the G7 and the G20. That is not what you hear out of Moscow and Beijing. The FT ran an article saying that's exactly what the Chinese want to do. And that's, again, why the BRICS as a substantive entity to really challenge the Western hegemony is probably not going to be it. But we dismiss the BRICS at our peril here. People dismissed Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, and they said he's never going to be president. And these people, remember, Hillary Clinton called them deplorables, right? Look what happened. They dismissed the Brexiters, the same grievance. In China, there is so much anti-US grievance. Grievance politics is powerful. So again, just because they're not going to reach a consensus on some of the action items does not mean that this BRICS organization, its institution, whatever you want to call it, is not important and very symbolically consequential.
Our finance minister is quoted in this morning's business newspaper in South Africa as saying, put on the brakes with this idea of replacing the international payment system of SWIFT and dollars, because we're nowhere near ready enough to come up with a viable alternative for that. And he said from South Africa's point of view, 80% of our financial transactions are with the West. So for us to move away from a system which is used by 80% of our financial trading partners makes no sense. Is it a long-term goal worth pursuing in your view?
Well, it doesn't make sense for South Africa, but it makes sense for Iran, Venezuela, Russia, China, who are subject to U.S. sanctions. And they want to create institutions that are totally immune from Western sanctions. So again, in this case, the necessity drives the policy. So for South Africa, no, it doesn't make sense. But if the Chinese start moving over to an alternate payment system, it's going to be something that South Africa has to embrace at some level, simply because last year, you guys did $56 billion of trade with the Chinese, more than any other country. And I'm looking at the stats here. It's twice as much as with the U.S., almost 3 times as much as Germany. So if China says, guess what, we moved over to this new payment system, that's how we want you to settle our transactions, what choice are you going to have?
You said in a note to your subscribers late yesterday, early today, I'm not sure when you sent it out, to say that if this BRICS summit, the BRICS Africa summit, is to have any lasting relevance, it's going to depend on whether the supreme leaders of India and China can find some time to have a serious one-on-one conversation and begin to settle some of the big differences between them.
That is the only thing that matters. Forget about all of the other distractions around the BRICS. Forget about Putin. Forget about Xi not showing up at that event at the BRICS Business Summit. Forget all of that stuff. If Xi and Modi cannot resolve their differences, the BRICS has no future. Because at the end of the day, these two will be on opposite ends of the table. And this is a consensus-driven organization. So if they don't reach even a baseline of consensus to even talk to one another. So remember that these two are the largest countries in Asia. And at the last Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand last fall, they couldn't even look at each other. Okay? And it's still not clear. They're in the same, they were at dinner last night at your president's house. They've been on the stage together, but we have not seen one interaction between them. And so if these two cannot reconcile to a minimal level, and by the way, the domestic politics in both countries are not optimized for them to do that right now. Okay? So the odds are against a reconciliation, but that's what the BRICS needs more than anything, is if these two can reach some modicum of stability in the relationship, forget about happiness, joy, positive, just some modicum of stability, then the BRICS has a chance. But if these two can't, it doesn't matter how many countries you add to it, the BRICS will not be effective because they can't agree on anything, simply because if India and China don't get along, then a consensus-based organization won't really operate very effectively.
There's been a lot of attention here in South Africa, so sort of outside of the BRICS context, the bilateral relationship between South Africa and China. There have been a lot of deals signed attempting to address the trade imbalance which exists between the two countries, although China says if you analyze the figures more closely, then actually the trade imbalance is not as big as the surface suggests, and promises, big, significant amounts of money, 16 billion rand, to help us with our electricity emergency, and all these sorts of things are going on. So perhaps from a South Africa point of view, strengthening the bilateral relationship with China makes hosting the BRICS summit worthwhile, even if that key factor of China and India beginning to narrow their differences doesn't get achieved?
Listen, this is the most consequential relationship that China has in Africa. It accounts for about a quarter of all the trade. Numbers, I mean, it's the largest ethnic Chinese population on the continent, accounting for almost half the entire population. This is where most of the Chinese enterprises and companies have their headquarters. There is no way to overstate the importance of South Africa to China in Africa. The problem is that South Africa does not take this relationship very seriously. Okay, this is by far, as I just mentioned the trade statistics here, $56 billion last year, orders of magnitude larger than any other trading partner. The number of China experts inside the trade ministry, inside DIRCO, is minimal. China knows exactly what it wants out of South Africa. And I pose the question to South Africans, what do you want out of China? And that becomes a very muddled question. Very, very muddled question. And it's just shocking that we're 20 years into the China-South Africa relationship, and yet South Africa's strategy for China is as muddled today as it was 20 years ago. And that is shocking to me because this is your most consequential economic relationship and increasingly a very important geopolitical relationship as well. And it is just that's, again, you see China coming in with a very clear-cut strategy into South Africa, but the reverse oftentimes is not true.
Eric Olander, thank you very, very, very much indeed for making time for us this afternoon. Eric was with us via Zoom from Ho Chi Minh City, and he is the editor-in-chief of the China Global South Project.
Afternoon Drive with John Maytham
on CapeTalk.